So, Lone Rider here, and I was going to go for a bike ride, but it's raining, so I had some errands to do, and I had some thinking that I was doing as I was doing my errands, and I figured I'd set it down. And one of the things I was thinking about was the issue of the First Amendment. Now, the First Amendment is probably one of the most important freedoms in the United States of America. The concept that there's a legal protection for your right to express yourself, for your right to speak your mind, and for the results that there's a healthy exchange and back and forth of ideas in society, that one view doesn't forcibly dominate or suppress others. It's a moral imperative from the perspective of people should be free to voice their thoughts, and it's a pragmatic imperative also in the sense that we as a society benefit immensely from the fact that anybody with an idea can share it. And so it's totally understandable that people are very big on defending the First Amendment here in America. There's a lot of other countries that, for a variety of reasons, don't have this freedom, and we're one of the very few places, perhaps the only place, correct me if I'm wrong, that does. I would argue people have this as a moral right as human beings. The question is it legally recognized? And in most places in the world, it's not, which is kind of sad. But, with that in mind, it's understandable why so many people in the United States, including myself, are big defenders of this and take umbrage to any apparent, attack on it or restriction on it. But one of the reasons this was in my mind is because I've been hearing a lot lately about how people say, well, our current president is usually the example that comes up, that when you have a political figure criticize the media, that's an attack on the freedom of the press and an attack on the First Amendment freedom of expression. And no, it's not. Okay. First of all, the freedom of speech and the freedom of the press are not freedoms from criticism. So yes, as a American citizen, as somebody living here in America, you have the right, legally recognized right, to speak your mind as an individual, and if you're a member of the press, you also have protection of that as well under the First Amendment. However, it doesn't mean that if you say something that somebody disagrees with or that is flat out wrong, that somebody isn't going to call you on it. It doesn't mean that if you say something that maybe is correct, but that somebody disagrees with or finds unflattering, that they're not going to, argue with you about it or say they don't approve of it or whatever, or that they think it's wrong because they don't want to have an unflattering news story about them, whatever. There are very few restrictions in the United States on the freedom of speech, and I would argue that they're not really restrictions on the freedom of speech. They're simply exceptions in which it does not apply. Things like making death threats, inciting a public panic, slander and libel. These are things that they're not protected under the freedom of speech in the sense that you can take issue with somebody legally if they do them. A person who makes death threats can be charged with a crime. A person who incites violence or incites a panic can be charged with something. A person can be sued and found legally culpable if they slander or libel somebody, etc. But there's very few exceptions. And the reason is because this freedom is so important, both to people as individuals to have the right to express themselves and to think freely and so forth, but also to our society and its function. There's the issue of when you have people with power in a society, whatever form the power takes, and obviously with the government it's an issue. So you have people at the state, federal, county, local level, any level of government. There's the potential that somebody with power can misuse it. And because there's that potential, we all benefit when the media and people's just individual freedom of expression kind of functions as a check on that. So that if somebody, let's say in the government, is doing something that's wrong or that's not appropriate or that's worrisome, we can talk about it. We can disseminate that information. We can challenge it. We can argue for better ideas, maybe vote the guy out, whatever. This is important. And like I said, it's also a moral thing too. People have their rights should be respected. So there's very little restrictions on freedom of speech in the United States, except for these things like slandering somebody or making death threats, things like that. So a newspaper, for example, is free to publish, a disagreeable statement or even a factually incorrect one, as long as it's not slandering somebody. They can flat out lie about, take the case of the gun control debate. You could have newspapers talking about how semi-automatic only civilian rifles are the same thing as a military-style select-fire assault rifle. It's not. That's a flagrant lie. But since they're not slandering an individual, they're not lying about an individual. It's not slander. There's really nothing you can do, right? That. What do we do then in that case? There you have a case where somebody with power, namely the media, having the power over ideas, we all have the freedom of expression, but the media has obviously more, can reach a greater audience, etc. Well, what happens when the media starts spreading a narrative that's not true, but they're legally allowed to because it's protected under the freedom of speech? Well, I would argue nobody benefits from a false narrative being spread, so what do? The rest of us exercise our freedom of speech. We challenge it. We say it's bogus. We say, dude, this dishonesty will not abide, right? And we point out where they got it wrong. And in some cases, they get it laughably wrong. I remember a news clip I saw once where a reporter was describing a pump-action shotgun as an AR-15 and then trying to describe the AR-15 as an assault rifle. It's like, oh my God, it is what it is. Obviously, that's wrong. And, because we all have the First Amendment, just like the press does, if the press says something that's stupid or idiotic or, objectionable or that you disagree with, feel free to take them up on it. And, again, you end up with sort of a marketplace of ideas, and hopefully the best idea wins. But the point I'm trying to make is that criticizing the media is not an attack on this freedom of speech that we hold sacrosanct in this country. And I think the reason people are trying to say that is because they're looking at Trump and they don't like Trump for whatever reason, whether it's because he comes across as a bit of a jerk, whether it's because they disagree with his policies, whatever. They don't like him. And so, because he's criticizing the media, therefore criticizing the media must be bad. Basically, if Trump does it, it's bad. So, Trump criticizes the media. They look at it and they, criticizing the media shouldn't be allowed because that's an attack on freedom of speech. Not because it is, but because Trump's doing it and they don't like Trump. Here's my problem. Criticizing the media is your freedom of speech. It's not an attack on their freedom of speech. That's what freedom of speech is all about, right? Again, it's not freedom from criticism. It's not freedom from people debating you or calling you out if you say something that's not true, or even just flat out telling you to your face you're an asshat, right? And the idea, I think, is, Trump's the person in office now. He's the president now. So let's make this a bad thing now because Trump is doing it. Here's my problem. Someday Trump's not going to be in office anymore. I know a lot of people, look, there's a lot of things Trump does I don't like, right? But the point is that there are some people who just really, 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 I think the issues they take with him go beyond his policies. Maybe it has more to do with his rhetoric. His rhetoric a lot of times is very objectionable. But the point is that there are some people who are they're nuts on the subject. They're like, Trump, it drives them up the wall. Just like, to be fair, Hillary and Obama and other politicians have driven people up the wall in the past. I mean, there are some people who they're very polarizing personalities and figures. But here's the thing. I know it doesn't seem like it to some of you out there. It seems like this will go on forever and that the world's ended. But someday Trump's going to be gone. Okay, someday he's not going to be president anymore. And you'll have somebody else who's president. Maybe somebody that you do agree with. And maybe that person will read an unflattering news article or a news article that he thinks has a bias or that may just actually be factually incorrect. And that person may want to call the news media out on it and say, you know what, this is a hatchet job. You know what, don't believe this. It's not true. They're just saying that because they don't like me, whatever. And you may totally agree with that. You may want that person to be free to defend himself against false accusations or made up stories or just criticism that you don't agree with because you support that particular person. After all, that's the whole point of a free country, right? That we could actually discuss these things. One view doesn't forcibly dominate. Well, if you set the precedent when Trump is president that people can't criticize the media, then when somebody else is president, somebody that you may agree with, and they take issue with what a particular media organization is saying, let's say instead of Trump criticizing MSNBC or CNN, it's a Democratic president criticizing Fox News, right? Don't they have a right to do that? As much right as a Republican or a populist like Trump might have to criticize, the leftist media? Well, yes, right? That's the whole point. Now, I agree it is a little more alarming. It could potentially be a little more alarming when a government official, when an elected person, somebody in government, criticizes the media as opposed to you or me, because obviously being in government, they have more power than you or I do. So, we have to be sure that when they're criticizing the media, that it is just rhetoric, it is just an expression of their opinion rather than, a platform like, I'm going to crack down on the media. But in this case, that's clearly all it is. This is a guy who's a little bit thin-skinned and, sort of a grandstander, basically puffing up his chest and grandstanding, right? And you know what? That's his right. But whether or not you think that's his right, you should acknowledge that it's certainly our right as citizens, you, me, and the next guy. It's kind of a gray area when it comes to the government, because again, if a government person starts criticizing the media, then you have to wonder, are they going to follow that up with government action? Is this perhaps a prelude to maybe actual censorship? But by itself, so it is, I could see why some people might see it as cause to worry. But by itself, all it is him venting, okay? And the point is, we all have the right to vent. It doesn't necessarily follow that what we're venting about makes any sense, or is factually correct, or is something that anybody's going to agree with. But the point is, we all have the right to do it. And if you set the precedent that just because you don't like whoever's in the Oval Office now, and he's criticizing the media, that criticizing the media is verboten and nobody should be allowed to do it, then what happens when somebody that you like is in office and they want to criticize the media about a point that you agree with? Can they then not do it? Will their critics be able to bring this up and say, hey, 5 years ago you said nobody can criticize the media and that it's an attack on the First Amendment. So, President so-and-so shouldn't be allowed to do that. He's attacking the First Amendment. And instead of using that argument to, let's say, defend CNN or MSNBC against a diss by Trump, you're using that to defend, again, maybe Fox News or something that you object to because, president that you endorse is taking issue with that. The point is it cuts both ways, and the freedom of speech is not freedom from criticism. And let's have a healthy debate about, again, when it's a government person, is it worrisome? Let's talk about that, okay? But let's not confuse, generally speaking, criticizing the media with threatening the freedom of speech. If I read a newspaper article, whether I don't like it, whether I actually know that there's something in there that's not true, or whether I just disagree with the way it's presented, I have every right to say, I think that's bogus. I think that's BS. I think that's crap. I think the guy who wrote it is a jerk. It doesn't mean he's a jerk. It doesn't mean it's bogus. It doesn't mean it's crap. But I'm entitled to say that if that's my assessment. All right? And in some cases, it may actually be crap. We do know the media gets things wrong a lot. Again, the gun control example is so easy because the media just gets this wrong so often. A civilian semi-automatic rifle is not a select fire, fully auto, military-style assault rifle. Anybody who tells you it is either lying or misinformed. And since these big media companies and corporations have lots of money at their disposal and they have whole research staffs, I'm pretty sure they're not misinformed. So I have every right when I read something in the media, they start talking about assault weapons and they're really talking, or assault rifles, and they're really talking about, civilian semi-automatic rifles. I have every right to point at that and say BS. Okay? I'm not attacking the freedom of speech. I'm not trying to censor them. I'm just pointing out, I think that's BS. Um, you know, when we were working for mountain bike access here in Union County, New Jersey for nearly 3 years, the media's role during that was largely as a yes man to whatever the government said. They barely reported on it at all, and when they did, all they did was mindlessly parrot what the government said about the ban on mountain biking and about mountain biking. And a lot of times what the government said didn't make any sense. Whenever they were asked about the reasons for the ban in newspaper articles, they flat out, "Oh, we don't know why it's banned." Really? You're the ones who banned it. I mean, the fact that the newspaper reporter wouldn't even ask a follow-up question when told something that absurd, they either didn't try or they were just a government show, right? And part of me, biking in a park is not, mountain bike access isn't really a big issue that most people feel strongly about one way or the other. Obviously, the mountain bikers feel strongly about getting some fair park access, and the people who don't like mountain bikers or have some bias against that or just don't want to share the park, obviously they feel strongly about it on the other side. But the average person, unless they're looking at it as representative of the larger issue of how government is conducted and issues like, how do you use a public resource fairly and equitably for all, if all they're looking at it is, well, some people want to be able to bike in the park, most people don't care all that much about that sort of thing. Because it is a very sort of a niche issue. And so I don't think the newspaper reporter on the Star Ledger New Jersey newspaper had some kind of axe to grind for or against bikers or bike access, the way some politicians and some media people do on issues like gun control, which are big and grandiose and strike a lot of emotions. I honestly think this was just a case of the reporters were lazy. But the point is, effectively, all they were doing is just mindlessly repeating what the government people said, even when it didn't make any sense. In one instance, the government people gave a particular timeline for when the ban occurred, but in another news article, they gave another timeline, and the years were different. And nobody thought to ask, well, if you're actually just telling the truth, why would the narratives be different? Why would there be like 3 different versions of what happened leading up to this ban? When the government spokesman confesses complete and total ignorance of the reason for the ban, why does the reporter not follow up and say, well, if you can't even defend it, then, is there a reason for it? Should there be a ban? Like, what's going on? That's your job as government spokesman, right? To defend it. So whether it's just laziness and sloppy reporting, or whether you think there's some kind of a political bias or an agenda, the point is, if you see something like that, you have every right to call the media out on it. And it's I think, dangerous to say that criticizing the media is an attack on freedom of speech, because that in itself then represents an attack on freedom of speech. It silences the ability of anybody who's not a card-carrying member of some big media organization to raise issues, to point out what they think is wrong, to help contribute to the debate. And you know what? The average person who might not be a professional journalist might still have something of value to contribute to our discussions, whether on local or national issues. Certainly they have every right to voice their opinion. So, I mean, when I see the media falling down on the job, as they often do, whether it's a local issue like bike access at the county park or whether it's some big national thing, and I look at that and I see, my God, they're either incompetent or they're just a shill for one side or the other. Somewhere a real journalist is rolling over in his grave. And if you think me pointing that out and demanding that the media do a better job is an attack on the freedom of speech, then you have to ask yourself what that freedom is for, okay? Because it's exactly for that sort of thing. It's recognized exactly because it's a moral imperative that people be able to speak their minds, but it's also, we benefit as a society when there's a free, rough and tumble exchange of ideas. Not everything that everybody says is going to be agreeable or nice or PC. But you know what? It's better than having people not allowed to say things at all, okay? I understand a lot of people don't like Trump, and a lot of people are going to say if Trump does something, it's wrong, it shouldn't be allowed. But the point is, to say that because Trump criticizes the media, criticizing the media is an attack on freedom of speech, no, okay? Criticizing the media is part of the very concept of freedom of speech, as we know it. And, just recheck your premises, because making that argument, you're doing a disservice to everybody in the country, and you're doing a disservice to the very concept of the freedom of speech. Lone Rider out.